Hello, and welcome to a look at how climate change affects atolls in the Pacific Islands. People living on low-lying islands, which are known as atolls, would undoubtedly be at risk if climate change were to raise the ocean above their islands and homes. But now, I would like to ask you, if this does happen, what responsibility do we have as New Zealanders to respond to these threats? Well, reflecting on what I have already gathered during my research, it is most certainly our responsibility to help the Pacific Islands, as this would be a direct threat to number 27 on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right to enjoy the cultural life of the community. To paraphrase what I said in my A2 research, if these atolls are ruined by climate change, the community will lose its community life as a whole. As even if Pacific Islanders came to live in New Zealand, it would not be the place where all their stories and culture once was created. But perhaps it is then our responsibility to make sure that they can not only keep on living here, but also feel supported and able to keep their culture alive. Perhaps now I can draw your attention to what has been going on with atolls in the Pacific Islands. An article, The Pacific Islands, The Frontline, The Battle Against Climate Change by Chris Parsons, particularly drives home what is going on more currently. An average sea level rise of between 25 centimeters to 58 centimeters is predicted by middle of the century along the coastlines of specific island countries, which would be devastating for islands that sit at or just above sea level. If global temperatures increase 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, as is becoming increasingly likely, it is estimated that 90% of coral reefs in much of Pacific Island region to suffer severe degradation, which will have devastating effect on the marine species that depend upon these ecosystems. This points out how in danger Pacific Island atolls just might be, and how soon there could be damage and loss of life because of it. So basically, this should honestly act as a huge disclaimer to not only how serious this could be, but how soon this might become our responsibility. We would be wrong to think that Pacific Islanders would all emigrate to New Zealand, as some could possibly go to Australia. That would be out of our hands in how their culture might be able to live on here, but it doesn't mean it still can't. But this whole time I have been talking about what could happen when their culture actually already has been affected. Beyond Climate Science, Cultural Loss in the Pacific Islands by Anna Elsbeta Colander says that for Pacific Islanders, the land is more than just a place to live. It is a foundation of cultural and spiritual well-being. This is where the ancestor spirits rest and hold the stories of Polynesian origins, traditional rites, and values that connect the community into one being. Such a unique interconnection with land and environment constructs the Pacific sense of identity and collective belonging, which means that if we could prevent this anyway, we should, as this land is a part of their identity and can't be replaced. So it is a hard choice. You either save their land or try and save their culture in another, which would miss a huge part of what their culture was in the first place. Looking at how climate change is being prevented in the Pacific Islands, consequently, it makes economic sense for Pacific Island countries to strive to decrease their use of fossils, including by greater use of renewable energy. Doing so will also reduce their emissions of CO2 and set an example and challenge to the bigger countries, although as pits account for less than 0.3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. These efforts will have negligible effect on mitigation of climate change. China, the USA, and the EU between them account for over 50% of global emissions, and so all of them must substantially reduce their emissions if dangerous climate change is to be avoided. Which relates to the fact that this method needs to be globalized everywhere as soon as possible. This also speaks to the more optimistic possibility for Pacific Islands to overcome the challenges of climate change. I just wish it was easier to predict or answer what can actually be done to help the Pacific Islands not lose their culture, as we need to slow down climate change, as even if we aren't affected, many of us will be affected by what we could have done to change this, even if that is not clear right now. To lastly return to two sources I drew on in my A2 research, places and their constitutive elements are valued in various ways by various groups. As Hess and colleagues suggest, places are localities within which people and communities have particular effective relationships, which would speak for all people of all cultures and shows how places are sacred, which reinforces what I was saying about Pacific Islands and their connection to the land. Then we have Philip Case, who says, there is currently no legal framework under which people can claim refugee status in New Zealand. Because of climate change, there have been 2 high-profile cases in which islanders have sought leave to stay in New Zealand on the grounds of climate change, but these were dismissed, in one case after several appeals. However, the courts have allowed people to stay on other grounds where there is a family connection. Lone Tiato unsuccessfully appealed on decision of Immigration Tribunal on grounds of climate change in Kiribati, which points out the reality of how likely it would be to Pacific Islanders to come live in New Zealand on grounds of climate change. This would mean that there would need to be a legal framework in place, as this would need to change drastically. But hopefully this gives you an idea of how much this is our responsibility, how we can make them feel at home if they did have to come to New Zealand, and how we can avoid that and let their culture keep on living.